You've met this person before. Maybe you've been this person before. They're clearly intelligent. You can tell just from talking to them for 5 minutes. They read constantly. They have opinions about things most people have never even heard of. They can break down complex problems with the kind of precision that makes you feel like you're watching someone disassemble a watch with their bare hands. And yet, at some point, they do something so profoundly, almost embarrassingly stupid, that you're left standing there wondering if you imagined the whole thing. They blow up a relationship over something trivial. They make a financial decision that a teenager would have second-guessed. They double down on a position that's clearly wrong, in front of people who know it's wrong, and somehow seem completely unbothered by the fact that the entire room can see what they're doing. They self-sabotage at the worst possible moment, right when things were finally going well. And the thing that gets you isn't the behavior itself. It's the gap. The enormous, inexplicable gap between what you know they're capable of and what you just watched them do. That gap has a name, and understanding it is going to change how you see intelligence forever, including your own. This video is about the psychology behind why highly intelligent people sometimes act in ways that look, feel, and function exactly like stupidity. Not because they've suddenly lost their intelligence, but because intelligence on its own is not what most people think it is. It doesn't protect you from the things that matter most. And in some cases, it actually makes those things worse. If you've ever watched someone brilliant make an obviously terrible decision and felt confused, or if you've ever looked back at one of your own choices and thought, I knew better, so why did I do that? What you're about to hear is going to feel very personal, because it is. Before we go any further, if you're new here, this channel is about behavioral psychology applied to real life. We break down the patterns behind why people do what they do, especially the patterns they don't know they have. If that's the kind of content that actually makes you think differently about the world, hit subscribe. Every video here is designed to give you something you can't unsee. And once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Now, let's start with what most people get completely wrong about intelligence. When most people say someone is smart, what they actually mean is that the person is good at processing and communicating information. They score well on tests, they reason quickly, they can hold multiple variables in their head at once, they make logical connections that other people miss. In short, they're cognitively fast and accurate, and in the context of solving well-defined problems, math problems, chess, engineering, law, that kind of intelligence is enormously powerful. It works. It delivers results. So for a long time, the assumption was that if you were smart enough in that way, everything else would follow. You'd make better decisions. You'd have healthier relationships. You'd handle pressure more gracefully. You'd learn from your mistakes faster. Intelligence was treated almost like a master key, a single capability that unlocked all the rooms. But here's what decades of behavioral research have consistently shown. That's not how it works. At all. In fact, some of the most consistent findings in the psychology of decision-making show that higher cognitive intelligence actually correlates with specific types of irrational behavior. Not fewer. More. Because the same mental machinery that makes someone brilliant at certain tasks can become the exact machinery they use to rationalize, distort, avoid, and double down in ways that are spectacular in their dysfunction. There is a term for this, and it's not widely known outside academic psychology, which is part of why so few people protect themselves against it. It's called dysrationalia. Coined by cognitive scientist Keith Stanovich, dysrationalia refers to the inability to think and behave rationally despite having adequate intelligence. And the key word there is despite. Despite the intelligence, not because of a lack of it. Stanovich's research found that IQ and rationality are largely independent. You can have one without the other. You can have a great deal of one and almost none of the other. And what predicts real-world success, real-world decision quality, real-world behavioral patterns, is not raw intelligence. It's what he calls the rational thinking quotient, the ability to actually use your mind well, under real conditions, with real emotional stakes, real social pressure, and real information uncertainty. And here's where it gets personal. Most intelligent people have never been taught anything about the rational thinking quotient. They were praised for being smart. They were rewarded for being fast. They were selected, from an early age, for cognitive performance. So they built an identity around it. And that identity, that sense of self as the smart one, becomes one of the most powerful predictors of irrational behavior they will ever encounter. Because the moment your intelligence becomes part of your identity, protecting your intelligence becomes more important than using it correctly. You stop asking, "Am I right?" and you start unconsciously asking, "How do I stay appearing right?" And those two questions lead to completely different behaviors. Let me show you exactly how this plays out. Because it's not abstract. It shows up in specific, recognizable patterns. Patterns that are so common, so predictable, so psychologically systematic that once you see them, you'll recognize them in people around you within the next 48 hours. Guaranteed. The first pattern is what psychologists call the sophistication effect, and it's one of the most counterintuitive findings in the entire field. Here's the basic version. When you give people a question that has an emotionally charged or politically loaded answer, more intelligent people, people with higher verbal and numerical reasoning scores, are actually more likely to show motivated reasoning in their responses. Not less likely. More. Why? Because motivated reasoning is the cognitive process of working backwards from a conclusion you already want to reach. You start with the answer you want, and then you use your intelligence to build the argument that gets you there. And the more intelligent you are, the better you are at building that argument. You can find more supporting evidence. You can construct more sophisticated rationalizations. You can anticipate counterarguments and preemptively neutralize them. You can make a completely biased conclusion look, sound, and feel like the product of careful analysis. Less intelligent people who engage in motivated reasoning tend to produce arguments that fall apart quickly. They can't sustain the rationalization for very long. But a highly intelligent person can sustain it indefinitely. They can write a dissertation defending something they feel emotionally attached to, while genuinely believing they arrived at their position objectively. This is not dishonesty. That's the terrifying part. They believe it. They can't see the backwards direction of travel because they've covered the tracks so thoroughly. The sophistication effect is why the smartest people in the room can sometimes be the last to update their views when evidence changes. Because they didn't arrive at their views through evidence. They arrived through feeling, and then constructed evidence around feeling. The more sophisticated the construction, the harder it is to dismantle. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because the person has already pre-refuted the evidence in their own mind, months or years ago, in a private monologue that no one else ever heard. This is why you can present an intelligent person with overwhelming counter-evidence and watch them systematically dismiss every single piece of it. They're not being stupid. They're being extremely smart, at the wrong job. The second pattern is even more personal. It's called the intelligence trap, and it's the behavioral consequence of building your identity around being smart. Here's what the identity does. When you're the smart one, when that's how people see you, and more importantly, when that's how you see yourself, failure doesn't just feel bad, it feels existentially threatening. Because failure is evidence against the identity. Failure says, maybe you're not as smart as you thought, and if you're not as smart as you thought, then who are you? So the unconscious mind does what it always does with existential threats. It avoids them. Not through cowardice, but through strategy. The strategies are sophisticated and varied, but they all serve the same function. Protect the self-concept from disconfirming evidence. The most common strategy is effort withdrawal. You've seen this. The brilliant student who underperforms and says, "I didn't really try." The talented professional who never fully commits to a project. The person who always has a reason why they haven't done the thing yet. The book, the business, the conversation. The reason is never, "I'm afraid I'm not good enough." The reason is always about external circumstances, because externally circumstantial failure doesn't touch the identity. If I failed because I was busy, I'm still smart. If I fail because I genuinely tried and genuinely wasn't good enough, that's a different story. And that story is one the identity refuses to let you tell. The second strategy is intellectual superiority as armor. When you feel your intelligence being threatened by a better argument, by a smarter person in the room, by evidence that you were wrong, one way to avoid the discomfort is to move into contempt, to subtly dismiss the other person, to find flaws in their reasoning, their credentials, their character, to make the threat smaller by making the threatening person smaller. This looks like arrogance, and from the outside it reads as arrogance, but underneath it is raw vulnerability. It is a person terrified of being seen as not enough, using their sharpest weapon, their intelligence, as a shield. The third strategy is the most damaging, and it's the one most people never recognize in themselves. It's called intellectual self-handicapping, and it's the pattern of unconsciously choosing environments, relationships, and challenges where you're guaranteed to be the smartest person present, where there's no real competition, where the ceiling is low enough that you can touch it easily. This feels like comfort. It feels like a natural fit. But it's a cage that was built from the inside. Because you will never discover what you're actually capable of in a room you can dominate. You will only discover what you're capable of in rooms that challenge you. And if your identity depends on not being challenged, you will spend your life arranging circumstances to avoid the very thing you need most. Now, the CTA I'm about to give you isn't an accident. We're at the exact point in this video where the pattern I just described, intellectual self-handicapping, connects directly to something I want to share with you. Something that helped me understand my own thinking in a way that changed how I operate day to day. There's a resource I've been using called the Sharp Mind Blueprint. It's a system built around 7 evidence-based frameworks for thinking clearer, faster, and sharper. And I want to be specific about why I'm mentioning it here, because it directly addresses what we just talked about. The reason most intelligent people don't upgrade their thinking isn't because they lack intelligence. It's because they've never been given actual systems for doing it. Schools teach you what to think. Almost nobody teaches you how. The Sharp Mind Blueprint is specifically designed for that second thing, the how. It's in the description below. If you want to go deeper on any of what we're covering right now, that's where I'd start. Alright, back to it. The third major pattern, and this one is the one that most consistently destroys careers and relationships, is what I'm going to call the analysis-action gap. And it's almost exclusive to intelligent people. Here's what it looks like from the outside. A person who understands the situation perfectly, can articulate exactly what needs to happen, and then doesn't do it. Or does it months or years later than they should have. Or starts it, then stops. Or plans it endlessly without ever committing to it. From the inside, this feels like careful deliberation. It feels like you're still gathering information. It feels like you're being responsible by not rushing. But what's actually happening in most cases is a specific form of avoidance that is disguised as thoroughness. Psychologist Barry Schwartz documented what he called the paradox of choice. The finding that more options, more information, and more deliberation often produce worse outcomes and more regret than faster, simpler decisions. But the piece that's particularly relevant here is what happens to intelligent people who overanalyze. They don't just suffer from decision paralysis. They start to use analysis as a substitute for action. The thinking becomes the activity. The planning becomes the progress. The evaluation becomes the accomplishment. And because thinking is something they're genuinely good at, it produces the same dopamine signal as actual achievement. It feels like forward motion. It feels productive. But it's a treadmill. The ground never actually moves. There's a reason this is more common in intelligent people than in others. Because when you're smart, the internal monologue of deliberation is genuinely interesting. There are real complexities to explore, real nuances to consider, real angles that less analytical people would miss. So the analysis never feels obviously excessive. It always feels like there might be one more thing worth considering. And there usually is. There always is. That's the trap. The moment of enough information to decide never naturally arrives for someone whose intelligence keeps generating new angles to examine. The behavioral consequence is a life that is extensively planned and insufficiently lived. Brilliant people who spent 10 years preparing for something and then didn't do it. Not because they weren't ready. Because readiness became a moving target they were unconsciously controlling so they would never have to find out if they were actually good enough. There's a fourth pattern that connects everything we've talked about so far. And it's one of the most psychologically sophisticated, and most destructive, behaviors in this entire category. It's called overclaiming, and it operates at the intersection of intelligence and social identity. Overclaiming is the tendency to assert knowledge or expertise you don't actually have. And in research by psychologists Stav Atir, Emily Rosenzweig, and David Dunning, yes, the same Dunning of Dunning-Kruger, they found something remarkable. The more knowledgeable and confident someone was in a domain, the more likely they were to overclaim expertise about things that didn't exist. Let that land for a second. When the researchers included completely made-up concepts in their questionnaires, fabricated technical terms, invented historical events, fictional scientific studies, higher self-rated experts were more likely to say they were familiar with them. Not less likely. More. Why? Because expertise in a domain creates a fluency bias. Things that feel related to your area of knowledge also feel familiar, even when they're invented. The expert brain, wired to pattern match and categorize, fills in gaps automatically. And because the expert is used to their knowledge being reliable, because it usually is reliable, they don't question the feeling of familiarity. They trust it. And that trust becomes the exact pathway through which false confidence enters. The real-world consequence of overclaiming is that intelligent experts make decisions about things they don't actually understand, while genuinely believing they do. A brilliant financial analyst makes a call in a market she doesn't actually know, because it felt adjacent to something she does know. A highly respected doctor gives guidance outside his specialty with the same confidence he gives it inside. A gifted strategist extends her frameworks into contexts where they don't apply, because the frameworks have worked so many times before that she stops questioning their applicability. In each case, the intelligence is real. The confidence is real. And the blind spot is equally real, and completely invisible to the person who has it. Now let's talk about the one that almost nobody talks about, and the one I personally think is the most important. It's the relationship between intelligence and emotional processing. And specifically, the way that high cognitive intelligence can actually interfere with emotional intelligence in a very specific, underappreciated way. There's a concept in cognitive behavioral therapy called intellectualization. It's one of the classic defense mechanisms, identified originally by Freud and later refined and empirically validated by defense mechanism researchers. Intellectualization is the process of using abstract thinking, analysis, theory, philosophical framing, to create distance from an emotional experience you don't want to feel. For intelligent people, this mechanism is extraordinarily accessible, because they have the cognitive vocabulary for it. They can take any emotional experience and immediately translate it into a conceptual framework. The person who just had their heart broken doesn't cry. They analyze. They explain the attachment patterns at play. They reference psychological concepts. They demonstrate their understanding of exactly what happened and why. They understand it so well, in fact, that from the outside it looks like they've processed it. But processing and understanding are not the same thing. Understanding a loss conceptually does not constitute grieving it. Understanding why a relationship failed does not constitute experiencing the pain of that failure. Understanding your own anxiety about rejection does not constitute working through that anxiety. Understanding is the map. The emotional experience is the territory. And no amount of map reading substitutes for actually walking the ground. What happens when intellectualization is the dominant response to emotional experience is that the emotional content doesn't get processed. It gets stored. It accumulates. And at some point, it stops being containable. It leaks into decisions, into relationships, into behavior, in ways that look inexplicable from the outside because they seem so inconsistent with the person's obvious intelligence. The brilliant person who explodes over something small. The analytical person who makes an emotional decision that defies all their stated values. The psychologically articulate person who keeps repeating the same relationship pattern despite clearly understanding it. They understand it. They just don't feel it. And feeling it is the only thing that actually changes it. This is the part that I want you to sit with for a moment. Because it's the piece that most smart people are most resistant to. Not because they can't grasp it conceptually. They grasp it immediately. But because accepting it challenges the premise that understanding is enough. And for someone whose entire identity is built around understanding, that's a very uncomfortable place to be. Let's bring this back to something practical. Because understanding these patterns, seeing them clearly, is only useful if it translates into something you can actually do differently. The first thing to understand about correcting these patterns is that you cannot think your way out of them. That's not a rhetorical contradiction. It's a literal statement about how the mechanisms work. Motivated reasoning isn't corrected by more reasoning. The intelligence trap isn't escaped through more intelligence. Intellectualization isn't resolved through more intellectualization. These patterns are not deficits of thinking. They are the misapplication of thinking. And the correction comes from somewhere else. It comes from building what Stanovich calls override habits, the ability to pause the automatic, fast, intelligent feeling response and apply a slower, deliberate check. And the critical thing about override habits is that they require something intelligent people often resist: externally imposed structure. Because intelligent people tend to believe they can create their own structure internally. They trust their own reasoning to catch their own errors. But the entire problem we've been discussing is that their reasoning is the thing that's sometimes creating the errors. You cannot inspect a lens with the same lens. You cannot audit your own cognition, using only the cognition being audited. What actually works, what the research consistently points to, is a combination of structured external accountability, pre-commitment devices, and direct exposure to experiences that disconfirm the comfortable patterns. In other words, seek out people who are better than you at the things you're worst at. Commit to decisions before you've finished deliberating, and deliberately put yourself in rooms where you are not the smartest person present, with a frequency that makes that discomfort familiar. The second practical shift is specific to the intellectualization problem, and it's simpler than it sounds. It's learning to separate the question, "What do I think about this?" from the question, "What do I feel about this?" and treating both as necessary, rather than treating the second as redundant once the first has been answered. This sounds obvious. It is not practiced. Most intelligent people have such a deeply ingrained habit of converting the second question into the first that they don't notice the conversion happening. The practice of noticing it, of catching yourself in the act of analysis when the situation is actually calling for something else, is not a cognitive skill. It's an attentional one. It has to be trained. The third shift is about how you relate to being wrong. This one is probably the most important and the most counterintuitive for people who've built their identity around intellectual competence. The fastest way to stop being threatened by being wrong is to change your relationship to correction. To start treating being corrected not as a defeat, but as new information delivered by reality, the most reliable source available. The people who update fastest when they're wrong are not people with low standards. They are people who have separated their identity from their positions. They don't become their arguments. They hold their arguments loosely, with genuine curiosity about whether they're right. And when they're shown they're not, they feel something closer to interest than to shame. This is learnable. Not easily and not quickly, but it is genuinely learnable. And the starting point is not a cognitive reframe. It's a behavioral one. The next time you're wrong about something and you know it, say so immediately, out loud, without qualification or deflection. I was wrong about that. 3 words. And notice what happens in your body when you say it. That sensation, whatever it is the cost of the intelligence trap in real time. Feel it, name it, and choose to pay it anyway. Do that enough times, and the cost gets smaller. The identity loosens. The intelligence becomes more available for what it's actually for. There's one more thing that rarely gets said in conversations about intelligence, and I think it's the most important point in this entire video. So stay with me. The patterns we've been discussing, motivated reasoning, the intelligence trap, analysis action gaps, overclaiming, intellectualization, they're not signs of character failure. They're not evidence that someone is secretly not as smart as they seem. They are the predictable behavioral consequences of a culture that treats intelligence as an end in itself, rather than as a tool. When we praise children for being smart instead of for being curious or persistent, we teach them that intelligence is the thing, the identity, the value, the proof of worth. When we design schools that select for cognitive performance and almost entirely ignore how people process uncertainty, emotion, disagreement, and failure, we graduate intelligent adults who are completely unprepared for the conditions under which intelligence actually needs to function, which is to say, messy, high-stakes, emotionally loaded, socially complex, information-incomplete conditions, which is to say, real life. The uncomfortable implication is that the people most susceptible to these patterns are often the people who receive the most cognitive praise early in life, who were told again and again that their intelligence was their most important feature, who internalized that message so deeply that protecting it became an unconscious priority that now shapes behavior in ways they cannot directly observe. If that's you, and I'll be honest, at various points in my life, it was me. The path out isn't to become less intelligent. It's to build a relationship with your intelligence that doesn't require it to be everything, where you can be wrong without it costing you your sense of self, where you can be confused without it feeling like a threat, where you can feel something instead of immediately analyzing it, and not treat that as a downgrade. Intelligence is a magnificent tool, but a tool you can't put down isn't a tool anymore. It's a dependency. And the smartest move you can make, in the very best sense of that word, is learning when to pick it up and when to set it aside. Now, because you stayed until the end, and if you've been watching this with genuine attention, you already know that staying engaged with uncomfortable ideas is one of the hardest things for an intelligent person to do. I want to give you something specific. There's a system I mentioned earlier called the Sharp Mind Blueprint, and I want to give you a different reason to look at it than I gave you in the middle of the video. Earlier, I framed it as a thinking tool. That's accurate. But what I didn't say is that the most powerful thing about it isn't the frameworks themselves. It's that it gives you an external structure for auditing your own thinking, which is exactly what we've been saying most intelligent people are missing. 7 evidence-based systems. Not philosophy, not motivation, systems. The kind that build the habits that make the patterns we've talked about today actually observable in real time, which is when you can actually do something about them. Link is in the description. It's worth your time. And now, before you close this tab, I want to ask you something specific, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments. Because this is one of those questions where the answers reveal more than people expect. Which of the patterns in this video did you recognize most clearly? In yourself? Not in someone else? Was it the motivated reasoning? The identity protection? The analysis-action gap? The intellectualization? And if you're honest, when did you last catch yourself doing it? I ask because the comments on this channel are genuinely different from most places on the internet. People here tend to be exactly the kind of person this video is about. Curious, analytical, self-aware enough to look, but close enough to these patterns that looking takes actual effort. So if you have an honest answer, and you don't have to dress it up, put it down there. It's worth more than you think. If this video changed something about how you see intelligence, yours or someone else's, share it with one person. Not for the algorithm. Because there's probably someone in your life who would benefit from hearing this, and who won't find it on their own. And subscribe if you want more content like this. Content that doesn't tell you what to think, but gives you better tools for doing the thinking yourself. That's the only thing we're here to do. I'll see you in the next one.